The Russian winter has always been more than a season. For centuries, it was a presence, a slow-moving weight that pressed down on villages from the frozen rivers of the north, to the forests of birch and pine further south, to the peasants who lived in small wooden huts scattered across the endless countryside. Winter was not just cold, it was life itself. It dictated the rhythms of work, the taste of food, the warmth of clothing, and even the pace of thought. And if you were a peasant in 18th or 19th century Russia, your very survival depended on whether you could prepare enough to withstand months of snow, frost, and silence. Imagine, for a moment, a small peasant village in the late 1700s. The roofs of the izbas, those timber houses, made of stacked logs, are blanketed in heavy snow, their steep angles designed to keep the drifts sliding off instead of collapsing the roof beams. Thin threads of smoke drift from chimneys made of clay and stone, rising slowly into the gray sky, carrying with them the smell of birchwood, cabbage soup, and damp wool. Inside, families gather close, not out of sentimentality, but necessity. For warmth, for light, for the comfort of human breath in a world where the air outside could cut like glass against skin. Peasant life was unimaginably ordinary in its struggle. From November until sometimes April, the soil slept beneath ice, and there was little farming to be done. Instead, life became a cycle of rationing, repairing, and enduring. Families counted sacks of rye flour, dried fish, and root vegetables stored in cellars dug beneath the frozen earth. They mended sheepskin coats worn thin at the elbows. They carved wooden tools by the light of flickering tallow candles, saving every drop of wax as if it were gold. And at night, they told stories half folklore, half memory, meant as much to pass the hours as to knit together the fragile thread of hope that spring would eventually return. But winter was not merely endured. It reshaped everything, from the way peasants built their homes to the foods they cooked. The izba itself was designed around the giant clay pek, the stove, which filled half the house. It was not just for cooking, but for heating and sleeping as well. Entire families sometimes crowded onto the warm flat top of the stove at night, curling together under wool blankets, with children pressed closest to the heat. Chickens might roost in corners of the house, their feathers giving off a faint warmth, while pigs or goats huddled in nearby sheds, insulated by straw. It was not comfort by modern standards, but in those frozen months, it was life preserved. The diet of winter was simple, repetitive, and heavy. Rye bread was the staple, dense, dark loaves that kept for weeks. Pickled cabbage, barrels of sauerkraut, salted cucumbers, and dried mushrooms added sourness and texture when fresh greens were impossible to find. Fish caught during warmer months, salted or dried, provided protein. On rare occasions, meat was stewed, often stretched with grains to make it last. And always there was kosher porridge made from buckwheat oats, or millet served hot in bowls carved from wood, steaming in the dim light of the izba. Yet food was only one part of survival. Clothing, too, was a fortress against the endless cold. Peasants wore layers of linen undergarments covered by thick kaftans made of wool or hemp, and topped with heavy sheepskin coats called shubi. Felt boots, known as valenki, kept feet insulated even at 40 below, while mittens were lined with fur and tied at the wrists with woolen strings. These garments were not luxuries, they were heirlooms, passed down from parent to child, patched and mended until they were little more than layers of repairs stitched together. Winter shaped even the social calendar. Marriages were often arranged in the long nights, when families had more time to gather and negotiate dowries. Festivals, like Maslenitsa, the butter festival that marked the end of winter, were anticipated for months, celebrated with pancakes, sleigh rides, and music. Religious observances, too, took on deeper meaning in the frozen months, when icons glowed by candlelight in homes, and the village priest's voice carried across the snow like a reminder that endurance itself was a form of devotion. But perhaps the most striking thing about peasant life in winter was its quiet. Outside the izba, the landscape was muffled under snow. The crunch of boots on frozen ground, the creak of a sledge runner, or the distant bark of a dog might be the only sounds to break the stillness. Inside, the crackle of wood in the stove, the murmur of a lullaby, or the hiss of boiling water marked the slow passage of time. For months, this rhythm endured, small sounds in great silence, a steady heartbeat of survival. And yet, in this stillness, there was resilience. The peasants of Russia, bound to the land and the seasons, found ways not only to endure winter, but to weave it into their culture, their habits, and their faith. To survive was to be Russian. To live through endless winters was to understand that patience, thrift, and endurance were not just virtues, but necessities. The endurance of Russian peasants during the winter months was not only about keeping themselves alive within the four log walls of the izba. It was equally about adapting the wider village environment to withstand months of frost and snow. The village itself functioned almost like a single organism, where every household contributed in some way to the collective survival. Paths were not paved but packed down by countless footsteps and sleigh runners. As the first heavy snows arrived, villagers would take care to trample and smooth the trails between houses, barns, and the church. Over time, these paths became narrow corridors of compressed snow, gleaming silver under moonlight, with high walls of drifted snow on either side. Children would run along them by day, their laughter echoing faintly through the still air, while at night, lanterns or pine torches sometimes lit the way when someone carried water or went to tend livestock. The barns themselves were as important as the izbas, for animals were at the very center of survival. Cows, horses, pigs, and goats were often housed just a few steps away from the family hut, and in some cases, small animals shared space inside. Their breath, their warmth, and even the sound of their chewing hay became part of the winter soundscape. Hay, stored in great mounds beneath protective roofs, had to last until spring, and so rations were carefully measured. Peasants often added straw, dry leaves, or even chopped reeds into fodder to stretch the hay supply, a practice learned from centuries of necessity. And then there was water, another daily struggle of winter. Streams and rivers froze over, sometimes to depths of a meter or more. Peasants would chop through the ice with axes, opening small wells where the water still ran. These holes would freeze again in hours, forcing the villagers to break them open each day. Buckets of water were carried home on wooden yokes, balanced across shoulders, with frost forming along the rims as soon as they were lifted into the air. The act of fetching water was as essential as it was exhausting, a task repeated every morning and evening without fail. The rhythm of winter life extended into crafts that kept hands busy and minds distracted from hunger or cold. Men often repaired tools, carved new sledges, or made wooden utensils. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and patched clothing. Children learned by imitations. Mall boys were given dull knives and scraps of wood, carving toy animals or tiny sleds, while girls practiced with needles and scraps of fabric, slowly learning the fine, steady stitches that held garments together. These long evenings were illuminated by the dim glow of rushlight, strips of rush plants dipped in animal fat, or by tallow candles saved for the darkest months. The shadows they cast danced slowly on wooden walls, giving the illusion of movement in an otherwise still world. The peasant winter was also a time of close-knit storytelling. In those long, frozen nights, when the wind whistled through cracks in the logs and snow piled high against the walls, families told tales. Some were folk tales of firebirds, witches of the woods, or frost spirits that tested the patience of men. Others were half-remembered histories of ancestors, of wars and famines endured, of saints and miracles. These stories were not told in haste. They unfolded slowly, with pauses for laughter, with moments when the teller sipped from a clay cup of warm broth, and with frequent interruptions from children asking questions. In a time before books or literacy spread widely among peasants, this was how memory was kept alive. And then, there were the rituals tied to the Orthodox calendar. Even in the smallest villages, the church bells rang out through the frost, calling peasants to services where they stood for hours, bundled in layers, their breath visible in the cold air inside the wooden chapels. Holidays like Christmas and Epiphany carried with them traditions of caroling, feasting, and, briefly, a lifting of the winter's heaviness. Children went from house to house with songs, often rewarded with bread, honey cakes, or small coins. These fleeting moments of festivity broke up the otherwise monotonous cycle of survival. Transport during these months was another curious feature of peasant life. Wheels became useless in deep snow, and so sledges were the main means of travel. Small hand sleds carried buckets of water, firewood, or baskets of food between homes. Larger horse-drawn sledges carried people to markets, weddings, or funerals. The sound of runners gliding over packed snow, accompanied by the soft jingling of bells tied to horse harnesses, was one of the defining sounds of winter villages. These bells were not merely decorative, they served as warnings to others on narrow snow paths, preventing collisions in the white silence. Even in times of famine or scarcity, Russian peasants developed small tricks to make winters bearable. Some used hollowed-out logs to insulate root vegetables stored in the ground. Others layered straw between the wooden walls of the izba for extra warmth. Women often wore several kerchiefs or scarves at once, layering linen, wool, and fur to cover heads and necks from biting wind. To keep babies warm, infants were wrapped in swaddling cloths and then placed near the stove, sometimes inside small wooden cradles lined with straw, which retained heat surprisingly well. All of these practices, though ordinary to those who lived them, became the invisible foundation of survival. What strikes us today is not the drama of heroism, but the quietness of the effort. There were no grand battles fought against the cold, no single invention that conquered the winter once and for all. Instead, survival was achieved by 1,000 small acts: a stitch in cloth, a log split for firewood, a candle lit at dusk, a child taught how to hold an axe or mend a shoe. The Russian winter was endless only in appearance. For the peasant, it was something endured step by step, hour by hour, until the rivers began to crack and groan with the promise of thaw. And while each winter felt eternal in its own way, it was these ordinary practices that ensured life could continue into another spring. Another part of enduring the endless winters lay in the way peasants measured time itself. For most of the year, the sun was their clock, rising early to work the fields, sleeping once the sky darkened. But in the long winters, daylight became scarce. In the far north, the sun rose late and set early, leaving villagers with long stretches of half-light and deep night. Peasants did not keep time by the hour, but by tasks: the milking of a cow, the burning of a candle down to its stub, the number of trips to the well before darkness. These rhythms were less about precision than about pacing, living the winter not as a measured season, but as a series of chores and pauses that gently pulled them from one day into the next. Work did not stop just because the fields were frozen. Men turned their hands to woodcutting in the forests, dragging logs by sled back into the village. Birch, pine, and oak were cut and stacked, carefully dried and saved. A poor household that failed to gather enough firewood by November risked a winter of misery and even death. Women, meanwhile, continued the slow labor of spinning flax and wool, their fingers raw from the dry air, but persistent nonetheless. In some villages, groups of women gathered together in one household, working by the stove, singing songs in low voices that drifted into the rafters like a warm haze. Winter also reshaped diet in subtler ways. Beyond the rye bread and pickled vegetables, there were small luxuries peasants relied upon for comfort. Kvass, lightly fermented drink made from rye bread was consumed year-round, but in winter, it became particularly important, providing both calories and a faint, almost cheerful fizz against the monotony of sour and salted foods. Honey, too, was treasured. A spoon of honey in tea, or spread sparingly on bread, turned an otherwise plain meal into something festive. And when supplies dwindled, even simple drinks like hot water with herbs were treated with gratitude, savored slowly as warmth filled the body. The role of the peck, the clay stove, cannot be overstated. More than a machine for cooking, it was the very heart of the home. Families gathered around it, not only for heat, but for companionship. In some cases, elders, or the sick, were given the privilege of lying directly on the stove's broad top, where the bricks radiated steady warmth. Children often crowded there too, forming a pile of limbs, blankets, and sleepy faces. The stove gave more than heat, it gave security. Its constant glow reassured peasants that, at least for one more day, survival was possible. The stark cold of winter also shaped how peasants moved through the outside world. Journeys were rare, but they could not always be avoided. Funerals, weddings, trips to distant markets all demanded travel even in bitter cold. Peasants relied on sledges pulled by horses, wrapping themselves in heavy sheepskins, sometimes even piling hay on their laps to insulate their bodies from the freezing air. For shorter trips, villagers wore valenki, the thick felt boots, so iconic in Russian history, and trudged across snowdrifts that reached to the knees or higher. At times, storms swept across the land so fiercely that roads disappeared entirely, leaving travelers to rely on instinct, the shape of trees, or the sound of distant dogs barking to find their way home. Folklore crept into these journeys as, well, stories were told of the Morocco, the frost spirit, who could be both cruel and kind. If you greeted him respectfully, he might spare your life, letting you pass unharmed through a storm. If you ignored or insulted him, he could freeze you where you stood. Such tales, whispered to children by firelight, served as both entertainment and cautionary teaching. In a land where frostbite and exposure were real threats, wrapping danger in the cloak of myth was a way of instilling respect for the natural world. The social order of the village was also reinforced in winter. Wealthier peasants, those who had larger stores of food or animals, sometimes lent supplies to poorer families. These loans, however, came at a price repayment in labor or in future harvests. In this way, the winter months became a time when bonds of obligation were both strengthened and tested. Mutual aid was real, but so was dependence, and the long winters sharpened these dynamics into everyday negotiations of survival. Children, though, lived winter differently. For them, the snow was both a burden and a playground. They were tasked with simple chores: fetching small bundles of firewood, carrying water, tending to chickens, but in between, they carved out moments of joy. They slid down hills on wooden sleds, built figures out of snow, and played games that left their mittens wet and stiff with frost. Their laughter, rising above the stillness of a winter's afternoon, was perhaps the most hopeful sound in a village otherwise marked by endurance and silence. The elders of the community, meanwhile, embodied the memory of winters past. They remembered famines, storms, and winters so bitter that even the strongest men faltered. Around the stove, they recounted these tales not to frighten, but to teach. Each story carried a lesson: to save more firewood, to mend boots carefully, to never travel far alone. The past lived within them, woven into anecdotes about how neighbors helped one another, or how an entire village survived on nothing but kasha and pickled cabbage for weeks. These stories were as much a survival tool as the axe or the stove. Finally, it must be said that for all its hardships, winter also gave a strange kind of pause. In summer, peasants were endlessly occupied with the fields, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting. In winter, the land demanded nothing. Though survival required work, it was a slower, steadier rhythm. Families spent more hours together, evenings stretched long, and moments of reflection on life, on faith, on endurance were possible in ways the busy summers did not allow. For peasants, winter was both a trial and a season of intimacy, of sitting shoulder to shoulder while the snow pressed silently against the window pane. One of the most overlooked aspects of peasant winters was the soundscape that accompanied them. To modern ears, it might seem as though such winters were silent, and in many ways they were, but the silence itself became a kind of sound. The snow absorbed footsteps, muffled the barking of dogs, and softened the creak of doors and wooden fences. Yet, in that quiet, smaller noises became magnified. The hiss of boiling water on the stove, the crack of a log splitting in the fire, the scratch of a spindle as wool was twisted into thread. For villagers accustomed to the bustling noises of harvest and planting seasons, the winter's stillness forced them to listen closely to the little sounds of survival. Light, too, carried a unique character during these months. The sun, when it appeared, often hovered low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. Even midday light could feel dim, filtered through heavy clouds. Peasants relied on artificial light more than at any other time of year. The use of rushlight, slender stalks of dried rush plants dipped in animal fat, was widespread, providing hours of dim but steady glow. More prosperous households could afford candles made of beeswax, their golden light filling a room with warmth, while poorer families used tallow candles, which smoked heavily and gave off a distinct, almost pungent, odor. The presence or absence of light became a marker of social standing as well as of comfort. In many villages, winter also altered the way people interacted with space. The izba, usually 1 or 2 rooms at most, became the center of existence for months. Privacy was non-existent. Children, parents, and grandparents all slept within sight and sound of one another. The stove occupied the largest share of the room, with benches and sleeping platforms arranged around it. Tools hung from beams overhead, and bundles of dried herbs dangled from rafters, filling the air with faint, earthy smells. Chickens sometimes fluttered in the corners, and the occasional cat prowled near the stove, searching for warmth. This close living could lead to tensions, but it also created bonds of familiarity so strong that they became central to peasant identity. Despite the hardships, there was also creativity in these long winters. Crafts that could not be pursued in the busy summer months blossomed in the stillness of snow. Men carved spoons, bowls, and toys from birch or pine, sometimes decorating them with simple geometric patterns. Women embroidered linens or wove belts with bright threads of red and blue, their colors standing out vividly against the muted palette of winter clothing. Children fashioned crude dolls from straw or scraps of cloth, objects that may have been humble but carried the weight of imagination in an otherwise constrained environment. These crafts, though practical, also reflected a deep human need to create beauty, even in the midst of scarcity. The rhythms of faith intertwined with these creative moments. The Orthodox calendar provided peasants with a steady procession of fasts, feast days, and rituals. In winter, these moments were eagerly anticipated, as they punctuated the monotony of snow and cold. On certain holy days, villagers gathered at the church, not only to pray but to socialize, exchanging news, singing hymns, and sharing food. For peasants, religion was inseparable from survival. It provided explanations for harsh winters, promised spiritual rewards for endurance, and offered hope that every season, no matter how endless, would eventually yield to renewal. Social customs adapted to the cold as well. Weddings often took place in winter, partly because field labor did not demand attention, and partly because families could prepare feasts more easily when food was drawn from preserved stores. The wedding processions, bright with sleighs, music, and laughter, were some of the rare bursts of celebration against the snowy backdrop. Young men and women bundled in heavy coats sang songs that echoed through frosty air, their breath rising like smoke. These weddings were not just unions of individuals, but of families, and they served as one of the few times entire villages gathered in joy during the season. Another element of winter life was barter and exchange. Though markets slowed during the frozen months, peasants still found ways to trade. A family with surplus rye might exchange it for sheepskin from another household, or a skilled woodworker might trade carved tools for extra grain. These exchanges were often conducted informally, across kitchen tables or near barn doors, with goods carried by hand sledges from one isba to another. In this way, the winter economy remained alive, though muted, a patchwork of neighborly dependency that reinforced the social fabric of the community. For the elderly, winter held a different rhythm altogether. With less strength for outdoor work, they spent much of their time by the stove, watching the younger generations carry on the cycle of survival. Yet they played an essential role, teaching songs, prayers, and practical knowledge. It was often the elders who reminded children how to tie scarves tightly against the wind, or how to spot signs of a fire burning too low in the stove. Their stories bridged the past and present, reminding the village of winters survived and lessons learned. In a culture where written records were scarce, memory itself was a tool of endurance. Even illness took on a particular character in winter. Coughs, fevers, and frostbite were common, and remedies relied on herbs, poultices, and faith. Steam baths, in small wooden bathhouses, known as banyas, provided both hygiene and a form of medicine. Heated stones, splashed with water, filled the air with steam, and villagers struck themselves lightly with birch branches to improve circulation. Emerging into the snow afterwards, flushed and steaming, was said to drive illness away. The banya was not only practical but deeply cultural, a communal ritual that combined healing with purification. Through all of this, there was a constant sense that winter was both an enemy and a teacher. It demanded caution, thrift, and humility before nature. But it also offered moments of beauty. The sparkle of frost on window panes, the quiet of a snowfall at dusk, the rare brilliance of stars, seen on cloudless nights. Peasants lived in awe of these moments, even as they struggled against hunger and cold. Winter, in its vastness, humbled them, but it also bound them together, family to family, village to village, in a shared rhythm of survival that stretched back generations. Clothing, in particular, reveals much about how peasants endured the Russian winter. Garments were never chosen for style, but for survival. Yet within that necessity, traditions and ingenuity emerged. The most common material was sheepskin, used to make the tulip, a long coat worn by men and women alike. These coats, often heavy and stiff, were lined with fur turned inward for warmth. They smelled faintly of the animals they came from, a reminder of how directly tied to livestock survival could be. Women often added layers of woolen skirts beneath, wrapping themselves in aprons and kerchiefs that helped trap heat. Men wore belts around their waists, not just for utility, but to keep the tulip tightly closed against biting winds. Mittens of thick felt or animal hide covered the hands, and layers of wool socks were stuffed into Valenki boots. Every article had to be patched and repatched. A torn coat or thin boots could mean frostbite or worse. Children, outgrowing clothes quickly, often wore garments several sizes too large, sleeves hanging over their hands, hems dragging in the snow. Animals, too, were at the heart of winter survival. Cows, horses, goats, and chickens were not only sources of food, but providers of heat and companionship. Barns were built close to the izba, sometimes attached directly, so that the animals' warmth seeped into the living quarters. Caring for them in winter was a daily task. Cows had to be fed hay carefully measured to last until spring, while horses required special attention. Their hooves tended to prevent cracking from frozen ground. Chickens, delicate in the cold, were sometimes brought into corners of the izba, clucking quietly beside human families. In this way, survival was a shared effort, not only among people, but between people and their animals. Winter also shaped the way peasants measured progress through the year. Unlike modern calendars, where months are neatly marked, villagers often thought of time in relation to tasks or festivals. December was when the rivers froze. January was when hay stores grew thin. February was the hungry month. These names reflected lived experience more than abstract counting. The slow change in daylight was noted too. The first time one could see without a candle in the early morning, or the first evening when children played outside after supper, marked small victories against the season. These moments, minor as they seem, provided hope that the grip of winter was not unending. Psychologically, the long nights carried their own challenges. Melancholy was not a modern concept, it was deeply felt in those villages. With limited sunlight and heavy responsibilities, peasants sometimes described feeling a weight of the sky, a heaviness that pressed upon both body and spirit. The antidote lay in community. Neighbors visited one another, often bringing small tokens: bread, a jar of pickled vegetables, or simply stories. Storytelling was a powerful remedy. Ghost tales, legends of saints, or humorous anecdotes about village life were shared by firelight, laughter and gasps, breaking up the monotony of silence. These stories were not only entertainment, they were a form of collective endurance, binding people to one another through shared imagination. The winter landscape itself shaped behavior in subtle ways. Snow-blanketed fields and forests, transforming the world into a featureless expanse. Villagers often spoke of how distances seemed longer in winter, paths vanishing under drifts, landmarks obscured by frost. Travel required patience. A trip that might take an hour in summer could last half a day in deep snow. Peasants adapted by using sledges, skis fashioned from wood, or simply waiting for neighbors to break trails before venturing out themselves. This slower pace, frustrating as it might seem, fostered patience, teaching generations that winter was not to be rushed, but endured step by step. Rituals of hospitality took on greater meaning in these months. When a traveler knocked on the door of an izba during a snowstorm, it was customary to offer warmth without hesitation. A bowl of hot porridge, a place by the stove, and perhaps a dry coat could mean the difference between life and death. These customs were so ingrained that denying hospitality was nearly unthinkable. In this way, winter created a culture of shared responsibility, neighbors watching out for one another, villages welcoming strangers, each act of kindness a reinforcement of survival itself. Winter also left its mark on the natural world surrounding the villages. Forest animals altered their behavior, hares changed their coats to white, foxes prowled closer to the edges of villages, and wolves sometimes grew bold, following sledges or circling herds. These encounters were both feared and respected. Wolves, in particular, occupied a place in folklore. Seen as both dangerous predators and almost mystical beings, testing human courage in the wilderness. The peasants' relationship with the natural world was never purely adversarial. It was shaped by necessity and reverence, a recognition that humans were but one part of the winter's vast cycle. As the weeks stretched on, signs of endurance accumulated. Piles of wood diminished, jars of pickles emptied, sacks of flour grew lighter. Each family measured survival by what remained in storage. And yet, there was also a strange rhythm of satisfaction in this counting. Each day survived was a quiet triumph, another mark of resilience in a landscape that seemed designed to overwhelm. By the time the first hints of thaw appeared, the drip of water from a roof, the softening of snow underfoot, the peasants had already achieved what mattered most: endurance. Not in grandeur or glory, but in the steady persistence of ordinary life. Food preservation was perhaps the most essential concern. and the winter diet was a reflection of months of foresight. Long before the first snow fell, families had salted fish in barrels, hung strips of meat in smokehouses, and filled clay jars with fermented cabbage. Root cellars, dug beneath the frozen ground, stored turnips, carrots, and beets in the cool darkness, safe from decay. In winter, these supplies were rationed carefully, every handful of grain and every spoonful of sour cabbage calculated to last until spring's renewal. Meals rarely varied: rye, bread, porridge, cabbage soup, perhaps a sliver of salted pork. Yet, within these limitations, rituals of eating carried meaning. The act of breaking bread, of sharing even the simplest soup, became a gesture of unity against the vastness of cold. Villagers knew that no household could endure alone. Cooperation was woven into the rhythm of survival. When one family's firewood ran low, neighbors often contributed a bundle, knowing that the favor would one day be returned. If a roof collapsed under the weight of snow, men gathered with axes and saws to repair it, braving the bitter winds. Together, women, too, shared labor, gathering in one izba to spin thread, sew garments, or prepare communal meals. These moments of collective work were practical, but they were also social anchors, breaking the monotony of isolation. A song hummed by one woman at her spinning wheel might be taken up by another, and soon the whole room was filled with soft music that wove itself into the very fabric of the evening. Children, while shielded from the heaviest burdens, still carried their share of responsibilities. They fetched water from the frozen river, breaking the ice with heavy wooden mallets, or gathered snow to melt in iron pots. Older children herded animals into the barn and swept the floors of the izba, while the youngest found entertainment in small tasks like winding yarn or holding a lantern for their elders. Yet, they also carved out time for play. They slid down snowy slopes on rough wooden boards, shaped snow into crude figurines, or tested their balance on makeshift wooden skis. Their laughter carried across the snow, a reminder that even in the most unyielding seasons, joy was possible. Music and oral tradition became companions through the darkness. The balalaika, with its triangular body and twanging strings, was a favored instrument, simple enough for peasants to fashion and lively enough to accompany songs. Winter nights often echoed with folk tunes, slow plaintive melodies that spoke of longing, or quick rhythms that encouraged clapping and stamping feet. These songs carried history within them, recounting battles, love stories, or village legends. In many ways, the songs were living archives, passed from one generation to the next, filling the void left by an absence of written words. Spiritual life remained constant, woven into the daily and seasonal rhythm. The Orthodox calendar guided the peasants through a landscape of fasts, saints' days, and holy feasts. In the heart of winter, the festival of Epiphany brought special rituals. Villagers gathered near frozen rivers, cutting great holes in the ice in the shape of crosses. Priests blessed the waters, and brave souls plunged into the freezing depths, believing the act to cleanse the body and soul. Even those who did not enter the water watched reverently, the sight of steam rising from the river blending with prayers whispered into frosty air. The darkness of winter was thus pierced by moments of light and ceremony, grounding peasants in a belief that endurance was not only physical, but spiritual. The passing of days was marked by subtle shifts, nearly imperceptible, unless one lived so closely tied to nature. The squeak of snow beneath boots changed pitch as temperatures dropped or rose. The smoke from chimneys curled differently depending on the wind. Peasants became keen observers of such signs, reading the sky and the land as one might read a book. These observations were not scientific in the modern sense, but they carried the wisdom of generations, guiding decisions about when to travel, when to conserve fuel, or when to expect a thaw. Perhaps the most striking feature of peasant winters was the endurance of patience. Life unfolded slowly, with no possibility of rushing time. Days were lived in cycles of feeding animals, tending fires, mending clothes, and preserving food. Nights were passed in stories, songs, prayers, and silence. To modern sensibilities, such monotony might seem unbearable, yet for the peasants, it was simply life, an unending rhythm of necessity, made bearable by shared effort and quiet faith. The architecture of peasant homes was itself an answer to winter's unrelenting demands. The izba, usually constructed from pine or spruce logs, was more than a shelter. It was a carefully crafted cocoon against the cold. Logs were stacked tightly, their gaps filled with moss or clay to block drafts. Roofs sloped steeply, not for beauty, but to allow heavy snow to slide off before it collapsed the structure. Windows, often tiny and covered with sheets of oiled paper instead of glass, let in faint light while trapping warmth inside. The stove dominated the entire interior, its white clay walls radiating heat so effectively that its surface doubled as a sleeping platform. Families slept on and around it, layering their bodies for extra warmth, while pots of soup or kasha simmered slowly. On its surface, the stove was more than furniture. It was hearth, bed, kitchen, and symbol of survival, all in one. Winter traditions infused even the most ordinary acts with ritual significance. For example, sweeping the floor at night was avoided in many villages, as it was believed that good fortune might be swept out into the snow. Knocking on the stove was seen as a way to ask blessings from the household spirits thought to reside there. During especially harsh blizzards, families sometimes left out small offerings of bread or porridge at the edge of the barn, not only as a gesture of gratitude to animals but also to appease unseen forces that might guard or hinder the household through the storm. These small rituals, performed quietly in the dim glow of rushlights, remind us that for peasants, survival was as much about spiritual balance as it was about material endurance. Gender roles, too, shifted under winter's pressures. Men often took on the heavy work of chopping firewood, hauling water, or repairing roofs strained by snow, while women orchestrated the endless rhythm of cooking, sewing, spinning, and child-rearing. Yet these roles were not fixed. Necessity blurred boundaries. Women sometimes chopped wood when men were away or ill, and men occasionally mended garments or tended children when tasks demanded it. Children absorbed these lessons by observation, learning that survival depended less on rigid roles than on adaptability. In this way, winter served as a teacher of resilience, requiring flexibility as much as endurance. Leisure, though scarce, found small spaces, even in the depth of hardship. Card games, carved from scraps of wood or bone, entertained adults by candlelight. Knucklebones, simple games played with animal bones, saved from meals occupied children for hours. Singing was perhaps the most common form of relaxation, weaving humor and sorrow together in folk verses that often made light of hardship. Popular theme was the endless length of winter itself, with verses teasingly lamenting the shortage of firewood or the stubbornness of frost. In these songs, one finds a kind of resilience through laughter. If winter could not be conquered, it could at least be mocked. The psychological meaning of endurance in winter cannot be overstated. Days of sameness, blurred together, feeding animals, tending fires, patching garments, and yet, this monotony provided its own stability. Predictability was comforting in a landscape where nature could be brutal and sudden. Each small task, though tedious, reinforced a sense of purpose. A well-stacked woodpile was not just a pile of logs. It was a visible promise that tomorrow, and the day after, the household would remain warm. A jar of preserved berries tucked into the cellar was not simply food. It was reassurance against hunger. This layering of small securities built an invisible shield against despair, reminding peasants that survival was not achieved in grand gestures, but in quiet persistence. Seasonal markers were celebrated in understated but meaningful ways. The first time the stove burned less fiercely, the first icicle dripping from the roof, The first crow heard calling in the morning. All of these signaled that winter was shifting. However slowly, families took note of such signs almost reverently, whispering to one another that spring was on its way. These tiny markers were not just changes in weather. They were milestones of endurance, evidence that the long night was yielding to light. And so, life in the Russian peasant winter unfolded not in dramatic episodes, but in layers of adaptation. The izba, the stove, the clothing, the rituals, the songs, all were threads in a fabric of survival. To live through one winter was expected. To live through many was to embody a kind of quiet heroism rarely recorded in history books. Yet it was precisely this quiet heroism, the steadfastness of ordinary families, that allowed entire villages, and by extension entire nations, to persist against climates that seemed designed to erase them. Winter dictated not only how peasants lived, but also when they worked. Unlike the frantic pace of summer when fields had to be plowed, sown, harvested, and stored, the long winter months slowed labor into quieter rhythms. The fields themselves, buried under snow, lay dormant, giving farmers a rare pause from the exhausting toil of agriculture. But this pause was not idleness. Tools needed mending, plowshares sharpened, sledges repaired. Men sat for hours by the stove, carving wooden handles for scythes, weaving wicker baskets, or patching leather harnesses. Women spun wool and flax into thread, their spindles whirring steadily in the glow of the hearth. In this way, winter became a season of preparation, the hidden work that ensured spring and summer could arrive with households ready. In such a season, silence took on its own presence. Snow muffled sound, creating a stillness that seemed almost absolute. Villagers walking across frozen fields could hear only the crunch of their boots, the rhythm of their breath. Inside the izba, silences stretched comfortably, broken only by the crackle of firewood or the faint hum of spinning wheels. Words were conserved, not wasted. Glances, nods, and gestures often sufficed for communication. A child passing their father a tool, a mother handing her daughter a spindle, a grandfather stoking the stove, all done with little need for speech. These silences were not emptiness, but a shared language, born from familiarity and reinforced by the season's quiet. Health, however, was fragile, and winters often brought illness. Without modern medicine, peasants relied on herbal remedies, passed down through generations. Dried linden flowers were steeped in hot water to soothe fevers. Garlic was crushed and eaten raw to fight off coughs. Pine needles were boiled into infusions, believed to restore strength. The village healers, sometimes an elderly woman known for her knowledge of plants, was often consulted in times of sickness. Remedies were simple, but carried with them centuries of accumulated wisdom. Even prayer was considered part of the cure. Icons were kissed, candles lit, and words murmured to saints believed to protect against frostbite, fever, or the weakness of hunger. Survival depended as much on faith in these remedies as on the remedies themselves. The forests that surrounded the villages were not only sources of firewood but living presences in their own right. Trees creaked under the weight of snow, branches snapping in the stillness, echoing like distant thunder. Peasants entered the forest cautiously, for it was a place of both sustenance and danger. Fallen branches were gathered, bark stripped for kindling, and resin collected for sealing jars, or treating wounds. Yet forests also concealed wolves and bears, and their shadowy paths seemed to harbor spirits from folklore woodland, guardians, or mischievous beings who might mislead travelers. Respect was shown in small rituals, like leaving a crumb of bread at the base of a tree. A quiet acknowledgement that the forest was not simply a resource, but a world with its own will. Evenings unfolded with unhurried rhythm. Once animals were fed and tasks completed, families settled into the dim glow of rushlights or tallow candles. Shadows stretched across wooden walls, and the stove's warmth spread slowly through the room. Some evenings were filled with soft chatter stories, songs, or simple observations about the weather. Other nights were given over to long stretches of quiet, punctuated by the sound of spinning wheels, the soft thud of logs added to the stove, or the rhythmic clicking of knitting needles. Children drifted to sleep first, wrapped in blankets, on benches or near the stove's ledge, while adults lingered, their work extending into the night. Time seemed suspended, measured not by clocks, but by the slow guttering of candles and the deepening quiet outside. Underlying all of this was a deep familiarity with hardship. Peasants did not expect comfort or abundance. They measured well-being in smaller terms: a roof that held against storms, a store of grain that did not run empty, children who grew stronger instead of weaker during the cold months. These were markers of success. Winter was endured not as an interruption of life, but as its defining framework. To withstand it was not extraordinary, but ordinary, and therein lay its quiet dignity. If Section 1 placed us within the warm, smoky confines of the peasant Izba, Section 2 invites us to step into the snow-packed lanes that threaded one cottage to another, to walk among the clustered wooden houses of the Russian village in its winter form. Here, survival was not only the work of individuals or families, it was the shared rhythm of the community, every villager bound by a common pact against the season's severity. From a distance, a Russian village in January looked less like a settlement and more like a scattering of snow-covered mounds, each roof nearly invisible beneath its heavy white cap. Narrow paths had been carved between houses, hard-packed by boots and sledges, their walls rising as snowdrifts grew higher. The world outside the village seemed vast and threatening, but inside these winding paths there was a sense of enclosure, a fortress of wooden houses and barns holding warmth. Together, people moved slowly along these lanes, men dragging sledges laden with firewood, women carrying baskets wrapped in cloth, children trailing behind with small chores of their own. Neighbors greeted one another, not with lengthy conversation, for the cold discouraged lingering, but with short blessings. God grant you warmth, one might say, and health to your household, the other would reply. Words themselves seemed to freeze in the air, so they were exchanged sparingly, with the knowledge that too much talk outdoors wasted precious heat. Within this frozen web, community obligations were constant. If one family's woodpile dwindled, others lent a share. If a cow fell ill, several men might gather to lift it onto its feet, believing movement might restore its strength. When death came in winter, it often did. It was not a private matter. Neighbors built the coffin, others dug through frozen ground to make a grave, and women prepared food for mourners who had traveled through the snow. Hardship was not born alone. The village carried it together, quietly, with few words but many gestures. Even weddings, though rarer in deep winter, were not impossible. When they occurred, they became bursts of life against the season's monotony. Sledges decorated with ribbons carried the bride from one household to another, bells jingling as horses trotted along frozen paths. Guests crowded into overheated izbas, where windows fogged and walls dripped with condensation from body heat. Songs, laughter, and toasts filled the night, reminding villagers that even in the harshest season, there was room for joy. The Orthodox calendar provided a structure for enduring winter's long passage. After the solemn days of Advent and the quiet celebration of Christmas, the season brightened with Sviatki, the 12 days of festivity stretching from Christmas to Epiphany. During Sviatki, peasants permitted themselves a measure of lightheartedness. Masks and costumes appeared, with young men dressing as animals or spirits, knocking on doors and demanding small offerings of food. These mummers were not mere entertainment, or echoes of older pagan customs, half absorbed into Christian tradition, where villagers believed such rituals might chase away misfortune and bring fertility to the fields. Epiphany itself was marked by the ritual of ice-hole bathing. Villagers gathered at frozen rivers, where great wooden crosses were cut through the ice. Priests blessed the water, Incense rose into the frozen air, and brave souls stepped into the bitter river, believing the plunge washed away sin and illness alike. The spectacle was as much communal as religious. Everyone gathered to watch, to sing hymns, and to carry home small bottles of blessed water, stored carefully for healing in the year to come. When darkness fell early, and the stove's warmth drew families together, evenings often belonged to stories. Storytelling was not a formal art, but an everyday necessity, a way to fill long hours and to transmit memory. Tales ranged from practical lore warnings about wolves, tips for reading weather signs, to folk legends of household spirits and forest guardians. Children listened wide-eyed as elders described the domovoi, a small, unseen being who lived by the stove and guarded the family, but who could turn mischievous if disrespected. Songs, too, filled these evenings. Some were slow laments about hardship and loss, their melancholy fitting the season. Others were bright dances, sung half in jest to stir laughter. Work songs accompanied spinning and weaving, the rhythm of the tune guiding the spindle's motion. In every song, the community's voice was present, grief and joy carried together, shared so that no emotion had to be borne alone. Winter for Russian peasants was not merely a season, it was a symbol, an idea woven into their worldview. It represented trial, endurance, and testing. Spring meant renewal, but renewal had meaning only because winter had been endured. Proverbs reflected this. The cold tests the house, as trouble tests the man. Another said, winter is the teacher, summer, the judge. These sayings reveal how peasants saw the season not simply as a hardship, but as a shaping force, a reminder of humility, patience, and faith. Even art and embroidery carried winter symbols. Snowflakes, stars, and geometric frost patterns appeared in woven belts and painted chests, marking both the fear and the reverence with which people regarded the season. Winter was an adversary, yes, but also a companion, its presence inescapable, and therefore deeply familiar. Though most evenings belonged to the family hearth, some were shared among neighbors. Women might gather in one izba for a spinning bee, each bringing her distaff and flax. The work was serious, thread was essential for clothing and trade, but the gathering transformed labor into festivity. Songs were sung, riddles exchanged, and sometimes visiting young men brought instruments to play, turning the evening into a small, cheerful event. These gatherings, called paseroki, were particularly important for the young, offering chances to socialize, to exchange glances, or even to arrange marriages. The simplicity of such events belied their importance. They were, in essence, small acts of resistance against winter's isolation. Moments when laughter echoed against wooden walls, and neighbors remembered that life held not only endurance, but delight. Every village carried its own treasury of beliefs passed down in whispers, as much as in proverbs. Winter, with its long nights and strange silences, seemed the natural domain of spirits and omens. Children were warned never to whistle indoors during a storm, for it might call in a blizzard spirit who would scatter snow through the house. If a dog barked endlessly toward the forest at night, villagers believed a wolf spirit was wandering close by. Even the simple act of shaking crumbs onto the snow was avoided in some households, lest hungry spirits mistake the offering as insult rather than kindness. Fortune-telling was a common pastime during Sviatki nights. Girls, curious about whom they might marry, would stare into mirrors by candlelight, hoping a shadowy face might appear. Others dropped molten wax into cold water, interpreting the shapes as omens of the year ahead. These rituals were taken lightly in daylight, laughed at as foolishness, but in the dim hours of winter nights, when shadows seemed thicker, the gestures carried weight. Superstition, like the snow, settled everywhere in gestures, in speech, in small acts of caution. Even under deep snow, trade did not vanish. In fact, some forms of commerce thrived in winter. frozen rivers became ready-made highways, their smooth surfaces far easier for sledges than muddy summer tracks. Villages sent delegations to nearby towns, sledges creaking under sacks of grain, woven cloth, or dried fish. In return, they brought back salt, iron tools, or, when fortune allowed, a few bright luxuries like sugar or kerchiefs dyed in rich colors. The arrival of a winter market in a small town was almost festival-like. Stalls were hastily assembled. Smoke from food vendors filled the air, and the chatter of bargaining cut through the frost. Peasants wandered the stalls in layers of felt and wool, inspecting goods with careful eyes. Even those who could not afford purchases found joy in the spectacle, the sight of unfamiliar objects, the gossip overheard, the sense that their small world was part of something larger. For a few hours, the market became proof that life extended beyond the snowbound village, that there was exchange, variety, and movement even in the season of stillness. In these markets, and in the villages alike, clothing carried unspoken meaning. Winter garments were not merely about warmth, though warmth was essential. They also signaled status, age, and identity. The most common coat was the kaftan, often made of homespun wool, dyed in simple browns or grays. Wealthier peasants, or those who had managed a fortunate harvest, might line theirs with sheepskin or rabbit fur. Women's kerchiefs and shawls told their own quiet stories. Young women wore bright patterns when possible, while older women favored darker tones, symbols of dignity and restraint. Boots were among the most valued possessions in winter. Felt boots, called valenki, were treasured for their warmth, though they soaked quickly in slush. Leather boots, more durable, were rare and carefully patched year after year. A family that owned several pairs often shared them, with children taking turns when venturing outdoors. Clothing, like firewood, was never taken for granted, was survival stitched into fabric, carrying layers of care and necessity. Despite the dangers, winter was sometimes the preferred season for long journeys. Frozen ground smoothed the way for sledges, and rivers, bound by ice, became roads leading deep into the interior. Messengers, traders, even pilgrims took advantage of this strange accessibility. Stories circulated of sledges traveling night and day, bells tied to horse harnesses jingling rhythmically in the cold air. Travelers bundled themselves in furs, faces barely visible beneath layers of wool. The journey was punishing, but it was possible in winter in ways that spring's mud and autumn's rains did not allow. Travel also carried risks. Snowstorms could appear without warning, blinding eyes and disorienting even the most experienced drivers. Wolves sometimes followed sledges, their eyes glinting at the edge of forests. Yet peasants accepted these dangers as part of the natural order, relying on instinct, faith, and the small protection of charms carried in pockets, an icon, a cross, or even a sprig of dried herbs tucked into a sleeve. Perhaps what bound all these elements: markets, clothing, superstitions. Travel was the shared understanding that winter was not endured alone. Every gesture pointed back to community. The way villagers traded and borrowed. The way neighbors joined rituals together. The way clothing stitched identity into fabric. The way travel linked one frozen settlement to another. Each act, however small, was a reminder that survival was communal. Winter, in this sense, was more than weather. It was a mirror of the human condition itself. Long stretches of hardship punctuated by moments of joy. A season that tested but also bound people together. By living through it, peasants affirmed not only their own resilience, but their connection to one another, to the land, and to traditions older than memory. Though life was governed by snow, firewood, and food, it was also guided by the rhythms of the church calendar. The village church, often a simple wooden structure, with an onion dome rising above snow-laden roofs, was the spiritual anchor through winter. Its bells, muffled by frost, marked Sundays and feast days, drawing villagers along narrow icy paths to gather inside. Inside, warmth was scarce, the air smelled of wax and pine. Candles flickered against painted icons, and people stood shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in wool and fur. The priest's voice carried slowly through the incense-filled air, reminding listeners that suffering had meaning, that endurance was tied to salvation. For peasants, winter was not only physical, but spiritual trial, a season to be met with patience, humility, and prayer. Confession and communion became steady rituals, giving form to weeks that might otherwise blur into endless cold. After services, villagers lingered outside, stamping their feet, exchanging quiet blessings. Even these brief gatherings reinforced community, reminding each person that their struggle was shared and sanctified. For children, winter carried a different character. Though they shared in chores, feeding animals, hauling water, carrying firewood, the snow also offered play. They shaped sledges from carved boards, sliding down slopes near the village. They packed snow into figures, giving them sticks for arms and scraps of cloth for hats. Their laughter echoed in the frosty air, a counterpoint to the heavy silence that often pressed on adults. Games, too, filled the long evenings. Riddles passed from older siblings, tongue twisters challenged nimble speech, and songs taught rhythm and memory. Even chores could turn playful. Girls spun flax while singing. Boys carved small toys from wood scraps near the stove. Childhood, though brief and marked by work, had its own lightness. In the dark season, a reminder that even in hardship, joy could be found. Despite the deep snow, winter was never only about the present. It was also preparation for what would follow. Villagers thought constantly of spring, of fields lying dormant under white blankets. Men repaired plows and sharpened scythes indoors, their edges glinting in firelight. Women spun thread and wove cloth, ensuring garments would be ready for planting season. Every task carried a double weight. It filled winter's idle hours and readied the household for renewal. Granaries were checked again and again to ensure seed grain had not been eaten by rodents or dampened by frost. Tools were oiled, cartwheels repaired. Winter was harsh, but it was also time to gather strength for the labor ahead. Without these quiet preparations, spring's arrival would bring not hope, but disaster. Beneath these physical and communal patterns lay the subtle, emotional life of peasants enduring long winters. Isolation weighed on many. The absence of sunlight, the repetition of chores, the silence of forests could press heavily on the mind. Yet resilience took the form of acceptance. Peasants often expressed feelings not directly, but through songs and laments, weaving sorrow into melody until it became bearable. Proverbs reminded them that hardship was universal. Winter is bitter, but it passes. Faith, too, softened despair. Even if prayers did not bring warmth, they offered meaning, suggesting that each shivering night was a small part of a divine story. Families encouraged one another quietly, with gestures rather than words, shared loaf, an extra log for the stove, a blanket tucked over a child. In such small acts lay the emotional fabric of endurance. When seen together, these layers, faith, play, preparation, feeling, revealed the quiet strength of Russian peasant life. Winter did not crush them, it shaped them, binding individuals into households, households into villages, and villages into a people who understood that survival was more than endurance. It was patience, shared memory, and trust in the turning of seasons. Winter seemed endless, but always in the background was the promise of thaw, the murmur of spring waiting beneath snow. The peasants lived with that knowledge as much as with the crackling of their fires, their days a rhythm of hardship softened by faith, community, and a stubborn hope that warmth would return. Winter was long, but even within its monotony, cycles of feast and fast gave shape to the months. After the noisy cheer of Sviatki came the stricter days of Lent, when food itself became a discipline. Households set aside meat, butter, and eggs. turning instead to humble fare: black bread, cabbage soups, pickled vegetables, dried mushrooms, and It was not simply scarcity, though scarcity was real, but also obedience. For peasants, fasting was both spiritual and practical. It conserved dwindling supplies, stretched stores until the earth awoke again, and aligned human hunger with the rhythm of the church calendar. Children sometimes chafed at these rules, sneaking crusts of buttered bread if they could find them. But elders reminded them gently that Lent was as much for health as for holiness. On Sundays, the austerity lifted slightly, with the sharing of honey cakes or sweetened kvass. These small exceptions carried weight, tiny moments of relief that brightened otherwise plain tables. The rhythm of fasting and feasting gave peasants the sense that even hunger was ordered, patterned, and meaningful. When winter stretched too long, fairs punctuated the cold with color. Large towns or monasteries held markets that became more than trade. They were occasions of spectacle. Villagers traveled by sledge, bells tinkling on harnesses, to join the throng. Stalls offered dried fruits from far lands, embroidered cloths, candles of different shapes, even small trinkets for children. But beyond goods, the fairs carried entertainment. Bear trainers sometimes arrived, coaxing their animals to lumber through awkward dances. Jugglers, skalds, and traveling storytellers gathered crowds, their voices rising above the hum of bargaining. For peasants, the fair was a reminder of a larger world, one filled with novelty and variety, even if they returned home with only salt and memories. Food was central, too. Hot pies, roasted seeds, and steaming kvass warmed cold hands. The simple act of eating among strangers in the open air created a sense of shared humanity. For a day, peasants could step outside the narrow circle of their village and glimpse a world that was vast, strange, and filled with possibility. As much as fairs brought the outside world in, the long evenings indoors preserved the inner one. Oral tradition was the memory bank of the peasantry, a living archive passed from mouth to ear across generations. Stories of ancestors, half mythical in their details, were repeated at firesides. A great-grandfather who had walked through snow to serve in a distant war, a grandmother who once tamed a cow with a song, a family who had survived famine by some remembered act of cunning. These tales were rarely written down. They were preserved in cadence, tone, and rhythm. Children who heard them nightly could repeat them almost word for word by the time they grew older, ensuring continuity even when the details blurred. In this way, the peasant household carried history as a living thing, not a fixed record, but a fabric woven anew each telling. Folk tales, too, preserved cultural memory. Stories of Baba Yaga, of spirits who lived in forests, rivers, or barns, contained not only entertainment, but coded lessons. Respect the land, honor your household, beware of arrogance. Even in the most ordinary evenings, when a spindle hummed, or a pot simmered, these tales kept the village connected to its past, and to the invisible world peasants believed lay just beyond their sight. Memory itself became part of the peasants' endurance. In the darkest days of February, when food was low and cold, unyielding, recollection of past winters gave comfort. We have lived through worse, elders reminded the young. Stories of famine, of wolves, of fires, survived. These were not only warnings, but reassurance. If ancestors had endured, so too would their children. And so memory wove the season together. Fasting gave purpose to hunger, fairs gave relief to monotony, stories gave continuity to hardship. The peasants moved through their winters, not blindly, but guided by patterns older than themselves, drawn forward by the certainty that spring, however delayed, would return. In the Russian countryside, hospitality was not simply was survival. A traveler knocking on the door of a peasant hut in the dead of winter was almost always admitted, no matter how poor the family. To turn someone away in the snow was to endanger their life, and so custom and conscience demanded generosity. Inside the izba, guests were offered what little could be spared: a seat near the stove, a slice of bread, sometimes a cup of kvass, or a spoonful of cabbage soup. Even if cupboards were nearly bare, hosts made sure the stranger was fed before themselves. It was not abundance that mattered, but the ritual of welcome. Proverbs reflected this ethic. A guest in the house is God in the house. These moments of hospitality wove fragile but vital connections across villages. A passing merchant might share news of distant places. A wandering pilgrim might leave behind a prayer. Each exchange reminded peasants that they were part of a broader web of humanity, stretching across rivers, forests, and snows. When evenings grew too long, song filled the silence. Some were ancient chants tied to ritual, sung during holidays, or at specific points in the agricultural calendar. Others were laments, slow, repetitive, almost hypnotic, that spoke of hardship and longing. Still others carried a kind of playful mischief, lightening moods when the fire dimmed low. Women sang while spinning or weaving, their voices blending with the whir of the spindle. Men sang while chopping wood, the rhythm of axe strikes aligning with verses. Children learned refrains, repeating them softly until they carried the melodies into adulthood. Winter songs had a dual effect. They preserved memory, but they also created atmosphere. Their cadences soothed nerves, filled otherwise oppressive silence, and gave the household a sense of collective rhythm. In many ways, they were a psychological fire warming hearts when logs could not. By February, the winter seemed endless, yet subtle signs hinted at change. Days lengthened by mere minutes. But peasants noted it carefully. Shadows stretched differently across the snow. Dawn came a touch earlier. Icicles grew heavy at midday, dripping faintly before refreezing at night. Hope was measured not in grand transformations, but in these minute shifts. Elders spoke of them in half-whispered encouragements. The sun is climbing again. It was not yet relief. Storms could still bury roads. Frost could still burn skin, but it was the faint assurance that endurance had meaning. As February waned, rituals prepared for the transition. One of the most beloved was Maslenitsa, the butter week before Lent, which celebrated the sun with round pancakes golden and warm, symbolizing its return. Families cooked stacks of them, sharing with neighbors, laughing in the snow, even staging small sled races or games. Maslenitsa was more than merriment. It was an act of defiance against the cold, a declaration that winter, no matter how stern, was not eternal. Effigies of Lady Winter were sometimes burned, sending smoke into the sky as a promise that warmth would follow. For peasants, this was both ritual and necessity, a chance to laugh, feast, and remember that seasons turned, always, and inevitably. These customs, like hospitality and song, reflected the deeper truth of peasant life, that endurance was never passive. It was built from rituals, music, stories, and gatherings that transformed hardship into continuity. Even as February's winds scoured the fields, people were already turning their minds toward spring, sharpening tools, mending clothing, storing seed grain with extra care. Winter still held its grip, but it was no longer absolute. The peasants, by faith and tradition, knew that they had crossed a hidden threshold. The sun would grow stronger, the snow would one day melt, and the fields, lying patient beneath their white shroud, would awaken. Winter was harsh not only on fields and animals, but also on the body. Coughs, fevers, aching joints, these were common companions of the peasant household. Lacking doctors, villagers relied on healers, often elderly women with knowledge of herbs, roots, and simple remedies. Bundles of dried plants hung in rafters, thyme for teas that eased breathing, chamomile for calming stomachs, linden blossoms for fevers. Birch bark was scraped into poultices. Onion and garlic were believed to ward off illness, their pungent smell filling kitchens when colds spread. Some remedies were practical, others carried elements of belief. To drive out sickness, a healer might whisper charms over boiling water, letting the steam carry away the malady. The line between medicine and faith blurred easily. Illness was treated with both herbs and prayers, with poultices and blessings. The important thing was not certainty, but care, the sense that suffering could be answered with some form of attention, whether through plants, words, or gestures of comfort. Animals, too, had their own trials in winter. Cows and horses were kept in barns, where warmth came less from fire than from the animals themselves, their breath creating clouds in the frosty air. Chickens huddled together on wooden perches, their eggs fewer but precious. Goats and sheep provided both milk and wool, though fodder grew scarce toward the end of the season. Wolves remained a constant concern. Packs roamed forests, sometimes venturing close to villages, their howls echoing at night. Peasants told stories of them, not only as threats but as symbols of the wilderness, pressing against the fragile boundary of human life. Dogs were treasured companions in this regard, barking fiercely at the unseen, giving warning when darkness stirred beyond the fence. Every animal represented more than utility, they were threads of survival. A horse meant transport through snow, a cow meant milk for children, hens meant a chance at fresh food in the bleakest days. To lose an animal was to lose security, so families cared for them as carefully as they cared for one another. In the long hush of winter, when days differed little from one another, the voices of elders carried particular weight. Their memories extended further than the present hardship, reminding the community that winters had always been endured. Around the stove, they told of years when snow fell deeper, when famine pressed harder, when war or plague had struck in the cold season. Such tales were not shared to frighten, but to reassure. We survived then, we will survive now, was the unspoken message. Elders guided decisions on rationing food, on when to risk travel, on which remedies to try for illness. Their authority rested not in formal power but in accumulated knowledge, shaped by decades of winters. Children listened, sometimes impatiently, but in time, those lessons became anchors in their own lives. In villages where books were rare, memory itself was the library, and elders were its guardians. Peasants also survived by becoming keen observers of the smallest details. The tilt of smoke from a chimney foretold wind shifts. The thickness of animal coats suggested the length of winter still to come. Cracking sounds in the forest, the behavior of birds, even the way frost patterns formed on windows all became part of a peasant's lexicon of survival. This knowledge was not written down, but passed from eye to eye, word to word. To outsiders, it may have seemed superstition, but for those who lived it, it was practical science born of necessity. By attending to nature's whispers, peasants made choices that could mean the difference between scarcity and enough, between life and loss. Taken together, remedies, animals, elders, and observations, winter endurance was like a woven cloth. Each thread, fragile on its own, gained strength when bound to the others. Herbs gave comfort, animals gave sustenance, elders gave guidance, and observation gave foresight. None guaranteed survival, yet all together made it possible. In this way, the Russian peasant faced the cold, not as a single figure against an overwhelming force, but as part of a fabric, human, animal, spiritual, and natural, each thread essential. Winter might seem endless, but through these quiet practices, it was endured. One day, one night, one breath at a time. Winter, despite its severity, was considered an auspicious time for marriage. With the fields silent under snow and agricultural labor paused, families had the space and time to gather. Weddings provided more than joy. They strengthened networks of kinship that made survival possible. A peasant wedding was rarely extravagant, yet it was rich with meaning. Houses were decorated with embroidered cloths. Neighbors brought bread, honey, or small gifts, and songs filled the air long into the night. Even when food was scarce, villagers ensured that a wedding feast carried enough to be shared. Pies, filled with cabbage, roasted grains, and sometimes a rare cut of meat saved for the occasion. For the couple, marriage was as much about alliance as affection. Two families became bound together, promising mutual aid when fodder ran low or illness struck. In this way, winter weddings were less indulgence than strategy, weaving tighter webs of support across villages. Beyond weddings, winter also gave rise to smaller gatherings, known as pasidelki. These were evening get-togethers, where neighbors met in one household, bringing along their tasks, spinning wool, repairing tools, carving wood. Work continued, but with laughter, gossip, and stories to lighten the burden. Such gatherings made time pass more gently. Young people courted in quiet glances and shy exchanges. Older villagers exchanged news and advice. Games were played, riddles posed, and sometimes dances broke out when someone brought a fiddle. The warmth of many bodies in a small room was comfort enough, and the sense of shared purpose was greater still. Though much of peasant life was practical, it was threaded with ritual. Some households burned juniper branches in the stove to cleanse the air of sickness. Others placed small offerings of bread near the threshold, a gesture to household spirits, believed to guard the izba. When wolves were rumored near, families might hang protective charms, made of iron or carved wood by the doorway. These practices may seem quaint to modern eyes, but for peasants they were tools of reassurance. They gave meaning to events beyond control, creating a sense that hardship was not random, but part of a larger, knowable order. Rituals offered not certainty, but comfort, and in the long silence of winter nights, comfort was survival. By late February, even as snow still blanketed the land, peasants began to prepare themselves for spring. Seeds were sorted, tools mended, and plows inspected for the thaw to come. Yet this was as much mental as physical preparation. To believe that spring would arrive was an act of resilience in itself. Songs and sayings reinforced this mindset. Elders reminded the young that no winter lasts forever, while riddles and jokes lightened the gloom. Children were sometimes sent to scatter crumbs on the snow for the birds, a playful ritual that doubled as a symbolic invitation for spring's return. This hopeful turning of thought marked the subtle shift of the season, not in weather, which could still be brutal, but in spirit. Even the faintest sign of change, a patch of melting snow near a wall, the distant cry of a migrating bird, was magnified into reassurance. In the end, it was not only warmth or food that carried peasants through winter, but bonds, family, neighbor, ritual, and memory. A wedding feast, a shared evening of spinning, a charm hung by the stove. These were threads in a tapestry of endurance. Together, they created a fabric strong enough to resist despair, even when the nights seemed unending. For Russian peasants, winter was not merely endured in isolation, but collectively lived, shaped by customs and connections that turned a season of hardship into one of continuity. Even in the most punishing winters, children found ways to play. Their games required no toys beyond what nature and imagination provided. They carved sleds from hollowed logs or simple planks of wood, gliding down icy hills with shrieks that echoed through the frosty air. Snowballs, packed firmly, became weapons in mock battles, while snow forts rose as small monuments of joy in otherwise bleak landscapes. Sometimes games had subtle educational purposes. Running in the snow built endurance, chasing one another tested agility, and balancing on icy fences taught steadiness. Parents tolerated the noise because they knew that children's laughter gave warmth no fire could match. When storms raged too fiercely for outdoor play, children amused themselves indoors with guessing games, riddles, or puppets made from scraps of cloth and straw. In such diversions, imagination bloomed brightly against the monochrome of snow. Winter also invited a kind of creativity that was impossible in the rush of summer labor. Men carved spoons, toys, or simple icons from wood, the sound of knives scraping faintly beneath the drone of the wind, Women embroidered linens with red thread believed to guard against ill fortune, or wove belts with intricate patterns that carried hidden meanings of love, protection, or luck. These crafts were not only practical, but symbolic. A carved spindle could be passed down for generations, carrying both utility and memory. An embroidered towel might one day be used in a wedding, tying past winters to future springs. Even the smallest creation served as proof that time indoors was not wasted but transformed into legacy. As the wind howled outside, mothers and grandmothers sang lullabies. These were soft, repetitive, almost trance-like songs that soothed restless infants and lulled older children toward dreams. Some lullabies spoke of gentle animals, horses, birds, or cats, while others simply repeated sounds, syllables, or rhythms that calmed the mind. The act of singing itself carried meaning. A child rocked to sleep by song was reminded, unconsciously, that the world, though cold and uncertain, contained tenderness. Lullabies stitched emotional security into the fabric of winter life, just as sure as warm clothes stitched physical comfort. Peasants believed that unseen forces moved freely during long, dark nights. To guard against misfortune, charms were fashioned from iron nails, small crosses, or woven straw figures. Some households chalked protective symbols near doorways, while others placed knives across cradles, believing the sharp edge repelled wandering spirits. These gestures were small, often unnoticed by outsiders, yet they gave a sense of control. In a world ruled by frost, famine, and illness, such rituals created pockets of reassurance. Each charm was less about superstition than about declaring, silently, that people had not surrendered to fear. Toward the end of winter, certain communities held symbolic farewells to frost. Children were sometimes sent outside to shout into the empty fields, calling for the cold to leave and spring to return. Adults might bang spoons against pots, a noisy ritual meant to chase winter away. In some villages, effigies of frost or snow were built from straw and then carried out of the settlement, left on a riverbank, or even burned. Such ceremonies held no real power over the weather, but they anchored hope. They allowed peasants to mark a psychological shift from enduring winter to anticipating renewal. All these practices, games, crafts, songs, charms, and rituals were threads in the peasant fabric of survival. None could change the temperature or shorten the season, yet all served to lighten the spirit and carry communities through the darkest months. Winter, in its length and severity, threatened to crush the human spirit. But peasants answered not with despair, but with creativity, ritual, and togetherness. Every song, every carving, every child's laugh was a quiet defiance, an affirmation that life did not simply endure the cold, but continued to create meaning within it. Even in the deep cold, villages were not entirely cut off. Periodically, markets were held in larger settlements, where peasants trudged across snowy roads to exchange what little they had. A farmer might bring a sack of rye flour, hoping to trade for salt. A woman might carry spun thread or woven belts to barter for a piece of iron. The markets were modest, often little more than clusters of people bundled in sheepskin coats, their breath rising like smoke into the frozen air. Yet, they were vital. A handful of dried fish, a few candles, or a scrap of fabric could mean a difference in comfort and survival. Such gatherings also allowed news to travel. Rumors of weather, harvests, or distant wars reached villages slowly, but the market was a place where whispers spread. Even idle gossip about marriages, disputes, or a neighbor's good fortune provided distraction from the monotony of snowbound life. Occasionally, winter brought visitors, wandering storytellers or musicians, known in some regions as skomoroki, braved the frozen roads to perform in villages. They carried fiddles, gusli, a kind of harp, or even trained animals, entertaining households in exchange for food or shelter. Their tales could be bawdy, humorous, or moralistic, ranging from epic retellings of heroic cycles to comic skits that poked fun at village life. Children watched in awe, adults laughed, and for a brief evening, the walls of the Izbah seemed to expand with sound and wonder. Though the church often frowned on such performers, accusing them of frivolity or superstition, peasants welcomed them as rare sparks of novelty. A song from a stranger lingered in memory long after he had gone, carried on the lips of villagers, who repeated the tunes through the long nights. Winter, above all, required patience. Crops could not be hurried, snow could not be willed away, and illness could not always be cured. Instead, peasants learned the art of waiting, shaping their minds to accept what could not be changed. Patience took many forms. It was seen in the measured cutting of firewood, always leaving enough for tomorrow. It lived in the slow mending of clothing, each stitch done carefully to make fabric last. It was spoken in proverbs: winter is long, but spring is patient, reminding listeners that time itself was a cycle beyond human command. This patience was not passive resignation, but active endurance. It meant conserving strength, using resources wisely, and trusting in the rhythm of seasons. Without such patience, despair might take hold, but with it, even endless snow became survivable. Money was scarce in rural Russia, particularly in the depths of winter. Barter remained the lifeblood of exchange. A neighbor might lend hay in return for future labor. A spindle of thread might be swapped for a loaf of rye bread. These exchanges were not recorded on paper, but held in memory, carried on trust and reputation. To break trust was to risk isolation, and in a world where survival depended on cooperation, few dared it. Thus, the barter economy also reinforced moral bonds. A peasant who gave fairly could expect fairness in return. A peasant who cheated might find no help when wolves circled the barns, or when a sick child required herbs from a healer. This unspoken code of fairness bound communities together as surely as snow bound the earth. In such small exchanges, the rhythm of winter life continued, quiet, steady, and essential. Taken together, markets, performers, patience, and barter life in winter was not dramatic but textured. Each day carried tiny variations. A new song hummed, a new rumor shared, a new trade struck. These details, while small, were enough to mark the passage of time. Winter seemed endless, yet it advanced step by step, not in great leaps. For Russian peasants, this slow unfolding was both burden and blessing. It demanded endurance, yet it also allowed communities to build resilience, not in sudden acts of heroism, but in countless, ordinary gestures. For peasants, the endless nights of winter were not empty. They were filled with unseen presences. Long shadows and flickering firelight seemed to invite spirits into the room. Children were warned not to whistle indoors, lest it summon misfortune. Cats, believed to sense invisible forces, were closely observed. If one stared fixedly into a dark corner, it was taken as a sign of visiting spirits. People often tossed a pinch of salt into the stove for protection, or avoided sweeping the house late at night, fearing it might sweep away good fortune. Some believed that dreams held greater weight during winter, when the boundary between the living and the other world was thinner. Such superstitions were not merely quaint, but practical in their own way. They provided explanations for sickness, failed crops, or sudden accidents, weaving them into a moral and spiritual fabric that made the unpredictable less terrifying. Peasants looked constantly for signs of change, reading meaning into the smallest details. The behavior of animals was carefully noted. If chickens began clucking unusually, or a dog barked at nothing visible, it was said to predict shifts in weather. A sudden crack of the stove, or a loud snap in the beams of the house, might be read as an omen for the family's fortunes. Even the patterns of frost on window panes were interpreted. Intricate crystal shapes might be called the ferns of winter, and some believed that certain forms foretold an early thaw, while others warned of prolonged cold. The world outside was largely beyond control. But by reading signs, peasants felt less at its mercy. Dreams occupied a special place in peasant imagination. With nights so long, people dreamed more, or at least remembered their dreams more vividly. A dream of fire was often seen as good fortune. A dream of falling snow might suggest abundance. Conversely, dreaming of broken tools or empty granaries could stir worry. Elders often interpreted dreams for the younger, blending old wisdom with symbolic guesses. Though no dream could change reality, the act of discussing them gave shape to anxieties. A fearful dream spoken aloud could be softened, laughed at, or countered with a blessing. In this way, dreams became another communal thread, linking individuals' inner fears to shared understanding. Despite the deep cold, peasants were watchful for the faintest hints that winter might be loosening its grip. A drip of water from a roof, a patch of dark earth revealed near the stove sidewall, or the sudden appearance of crows were all celebrated as early signs. Children were sent outside to look for messengers of warmth, birds, or the sparkle of thawing ice. Women inspected seed sacks, readying them long before planting was possible. Men tested plowshares, sharpening and oiling them so they would be ready when the ground finally softened. These preparations were not hurried. Peasants knew better than to be deceived by brief thaws. But the anticipation itself was powerful. Even a fall spring brought a change in conversation, a fresh wave of jokes, or a sense that the hardship would not last forever. In this slow observation of signs, superstitions, omens, dreams, and drips of water, peasants trained themselves to endure. Each small detail was a thread in the fabric of meaning, turning silence and cold into a story of continuity. To the outsider, such habits might seem tedious or irrational, but for those who lived them, they were tools of survival. They gave structure to time, guided behavior, and transformed the seemingly endless night into something purposeful. Winter did not vanish all at once. It retreated by degrees, and peasants marked each stage carefully, finding in every omen and every dream a way to carry their spirit forward. The hushed turning of the season as winter's grip loosened. Peasants found themselves in a state of waiting that was no longer filled with fear, but with cautious hope. The superstitions, songs, and rituals of the long nights had done their work. They had carried people across the invisible threshold where hardship began to feel survivable. The drips of water from the eaves, the muddy footprints pressed into thawing paths, and the first scatter of seeds prepared on wooden tables were not yet spring, but they hinted at it. Each tiny sign was received with gratitude, as if the land itself had remembered its promise to return life. And so Section 2 closes with this pause, a moment between endurance and renewal. The peasants had survived the most brutal cold, and now they turned their gaze toward the uncertain but hopeful work of beginning again. The arrival of spring in rural Russia was not sudden, nor was it entirely dependable. It came in hesitant steps, as if the land itself were uncertain whether it should yield. Snow began to sag and darken, losing its crystalline sharpness. Thin streams trickled along the edges of frozen fields, forming tiny rivulets that quickly refroze at night. For peasants, these first shifts carried enormous meaning. The smell of thawing earth, damp, heavy, and unmistakably alive, was as thrilling as any feast. Doors were thrown open for longer each day, letting in not just cold, but also the sound of dripping, the promise that the world was changing once more. With thaw came labor. Tools that had sat idle in corners all winter were inspected, sharpened, or repaired. Plows, once covered in straw to prevent rust, were dragged into the light. Men tested harnesses on horses that had grown restless in the barns, while women began sorting the seed reserves with almost ceremonial care. Every action was accompanied by both relief and anxiety. A poor harvest meant hunger, no matter how well one had survived winter. Thus, spring carried not only the joy of release but the pressure of new burdens. Fields had to be plowed quickly before the soil hardened. Seeds had to be planted at the right moment, no earlier, no later. Children, once free to tumble in the snow, were now tasked with carrying water, gathering brush, or driving away birds from newly sown patches. Life resumed its cycle of necessity, but each gesture was charged with gratitude. To work the earth was to know that one had survived long enough to see it reborn. Yet winter never disappeared entirely. Its memory lingered in the body and in the mind. Some villagers continued to speak of dreams they had in the cold months, wondering if they still carried meaning. Others kept charms in place, reluctant to remove the protections that had seen them through the dark. Stories of the hardest nights, when firewood ran low, or when illness swept through, were retold as cautionary lessons, shaping how people prepared for the next cycle. Children, listening quietly, learned that survival was not a given but something earned through patience, thrift, and cooperation. In this way, winter extended itself into spring, not as ice or snow, but as memory, shaping the choices and habits of daily life. Communities often marked the true end of winter with small rituals. Some gathered to bless the fields, sprinkling holy water on the soil as both a spiritual and practical gesture. Others prepared simple feasts where bread and eggs were shared, symbols of renewal and fertility. In certain regions, straw effigies of winter were burned or drowned in rivers, a final act of farewell to the season that had dominated their lives for months. Laughter accompanied these events, not because hardship was forgotten, but because joy was permitted again. Such rituals reminded peasants that survival was communal, not individual. Winter might have been endured in each izba, but its defeat was celebrated together. Perhaps the greatest legacy of these winters was the character they shaped. Endurance was not dramatic. It did not involve heroic battles or sweeping victories. Instead, it was the quiet strength to wait, to conserve, to share, and to hope. This endurance bound communities across generations. Children raised on stories of hard winters grew into adults who prepared carefully, who honored patience, and who trusted in the cycle of seasons. Each winter was a teacher, and though its lessons were harsh, they carried wisdom that no summer could provide. And so, when spring finally spread its green across the plains, it was received not as a surprise, but as a long-awaited guest. Russian peasants knew too well that winter would return, but for now, there was planting to be done, fields to be tended, and lives to be lived. The endless winters had not broken them. They had only deepened the roots of resilience. In their songs, their stories, their rituals, and their patience, the peasants of Russia revealed a truth, that survival is not the absence of hardship, but the steady courage to endure it. Although snow had melted, and the fields stretched green, winter never entirely released its hold. Every task in spring and summer was shadowed by memories of scarcity. When rye was harvested, peasants immediately set aside a portion to be dried and hidden away, for the Black Day, as they called it, meaning the next hard winter. Women stitched summer cloth with winter in mind, sewing sturdier seams into shirts that would withstand months of stove-side wear. Men split wood not only for present fires, but for stacks that would season in the sun, ready for the next frost. Even in warmth, every decision leaned toward preparation for cold. Curiously, summer life often mirrored winter in its own rhythm. In winter, people gathered indoors around the stove. In summer, they gathered outdoors in fields, meadows, or near rivers. In winter, they exchanged tales to pass the time. In summer, they exchanged labor, helping each other harvest. Both seasons relied on cooperation, though the forms differed. Summer festivals such as Kapala Night, with its bonfires, water splashing, and flower wreaths, often contained hidden references to winter. Fire symbolized the warmth that peasants craved in the cold months, while water games carried echoes of melting snow and ice. Even in moments of joy, memory of winter shaped the symbolism. Elders, who had weathered more winters than most, served as living repositories of caution and advice. They were quick to remind younger peasants not to waste food in times of plenty. Warning: summer is careless, but winter remembers. These proverbs were not idle. They encoded lessons tested by time. Store hay generously, for animals eat more in the cold. Save more fat, for it gives strength against frost. Keep seeds aside, even when tempted to eat them, for hunger in March is harsher than hunger in August. Children absorbed these sayings almost unconsciously. As they helped gather mushrooms or berries, they heard constant refrains about how these foods would comfort in the snowbound months. In this way, the rhythm of survival became part of cultural inheritance, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Over time, peasants came to see winter not only as an obstacle, but as a defining part of who they were. To endure the cold was to prove one's strength, not in glory, but in patience. Songs and stories spoke of Russia as a land married to winter, where people and frost were locked together in eternal coexistence. This identity gave pride as well as hardship. A peasant might complain about endless snow, yet still boast of surviving. Conditions outsiders could hardly imagine. To endure was to belong. Winter shaped not only Bodhi's, but also a sense of collective self, binding villages together under a shared story of resilience. By the time spring matured into summer, and barns filled with fresh hay, the sharp memory of cold began to blur. Yet, it was never erased. Even laughter at a wedding feast, or singing during harvest contained, deep beneath, the awareness that hardship would return. This awareness did not make joy smaller, it made it deeper. Every loaf of bread, every song, every candle lit in summer was sweeter because of what had been endured. Winter had taught that nothing could be taken for granted, and so even the simplest pleasure was touched with gratitude. And so, Section 3 moves toward its close with this thought, that endless winters did not merely test the peasants, but gave them a philosophy of life, one that saw strength, not in conquest, but in the ability to bend, wait, and rise again. When warmth finally returned, after months of muted silence, the return of sound and color felt almost overwhelming. In winter, noise was muffled by snow, footsteps sank into quiet paths, and voices seemed to hover in frosted air. But in spring and summer, sound burst forth. Again streams gurgled, birds called endlessly, and even the hum of insects filled the spaces once dominated by wind. For peasants, this sensory abundance was not taken lightly. They listened with care to the chorus of frogs near rivers, reading in it the health of the wetlands. They studied the shades of green spreading over meadows, comparing them to years, before judging whether the grass would grow thick enough for hay. To live so close to nature meant treating its smallest details as news, as surely as city folk treated rumors. If winter emphasized survival within each household, the months following it emphasized recovery across the whole village. Men often rotated labor, helping neighbors repair roofs that had sagged under snow, or barns that needed reinforcement. Women shared surplus milk once cows began calving again, returning generosity offered during the lean months. The barter networks that had kept people alive in cold did not dissolve in warmth, they transformed. Instead of firewood or scraps of fat, now eggs, herbs, or woven goods passed from hand to hand. The memory of mutual reliance made generosity a habit, not a burden. It was not merely kindness. It was insurance, for all knew that another winter would come. Even as peasants resumed outdoor work, evenings remained times for reflection. Around bonfires or in doorways left open to mild air, they retold the hardest winter nights. How wolves had prowled too close to the barn. How a storm had buried paths overnight. How someone had guessed spring wrong and planted too early. These stories served as record and warning, but also as entertainment. The long quiet of winter had trained peasants in the art of turning small events into lasting tales. A broken axe handle, or a chicken lost to frost, could be recounted with drama and humor, woven into the fabric of village lore. In this way, Memory of winter became not just a burden, but a source of identity and shared laughter. Perhaps the deepest lesson winter left behind was patience. Waiting, once seen as hardship, came to be understood as a skill in itself, just as peasants had learned to accept that snow melted only in its own time. They applied the same calm to other areas of life, to illness, to disputes, to misfortune. A quarrel might cool as slowly as snow drifts, and that was acceptable. A field might take years to recover its richness, and that too was accepted. In a world where seasons ruled, impatience was folly. Those who endured longest were not the strongest, or loudest, but the quietest, the ones who bent rather than broke, even in the height of summer, with bees buzzing and children chasing one another barefoot. Winter's presence lingered not as fear, but as memory, shaping habits, choices, and stories. And though the cycle would repeat, the knowledge of survival gave each villager a kind of quiet pride, the knowledge that endurance itself was a victory. The shift from winter to spring was never seen as entirely natural, it was spiritual as well. Peasants prayed for thaw as much as they shoveled snow. Churches held blessings for fields before planting, and holy icons were carried outdoors to face the sun. Yet, alongside these official rites lived a thick layer of superstition. Some villagers believed that knocking icicles from roofs too soon would offend the frost and invite late snow. Others said the first thunder of spring should be greeted with laughter, for it frightened away evil spirits that thrived in the long cold. These customs were not formal law, but they guided daily decisions as strongly as scripture. Livestock had been companions through the cold, and their behavior was studied as omens of what lay ahead. A cow, restless at night, might suggest storms. A hen laying earlier than expected might foretell a warm spring. Horses, lean from limited fodder, were treated with special care in spring, brushed until their coats shone, as if polished for new beginnings. Wild animals, too, played a role in the seasonal story. The return of cranes, flying in great V-shapes across the pale sky, was cheered as the final proof that warmth would settle in. Foxes, seen in thawing fields, reminded peasants of the balance between caution and renewal. Even in better times, danger still lurked at the edges. Perhaps nothing marked the transition more clearly than food. In late winter, meals had dwindled. Too thin soups, dried mushrooms, and bread cut into careful slices. With the thaw, fresh milk returned, eggs reappeared, and soon the first wild greens were gathered along riverbanks. This return of variety was met with both celebration and strategy. Women carefully rationed the new abundance, knowing that overeating, after months of scarcity, could weaken rather than strengthen. Preservation began immediately. Butter churned in spring might be salted and stored, herbs dried on window ledges. Every taste of freshness was also a reminder to think ahead, to stretch the season's generosity across the months to come. The land itself was understood as a kind of elder, teaching lessons through its changes. Frozen rivers warned of patience, mud taught caution, and the first flowers promised reward after endurance. Each year's cycle was seen not as repetition, but as renewal of the same ancient lesson, that survival lay in harmony, not in resistance. Peasants spoke of fields as if they breathed, of forests as if they remembered, of rivers as if they judged. These were not mere metaphors. They were the language of a people who saw no division between themselves and their environment. To listen to the land was as important as to listen to a priest or an elder. By late spring, when nights were lighter and stars lingered over fields that no longer froze, peasants could look back at the endless winter without bitterness. It had been difficult, yes, but it had also sharpened their wisdom. They knew now which barns had been too weak, which food stores too small, which quarrels too foolish to carry into another season. Winter was not only endured, was studied. Every family quietly adjusted their habits, whether by stacking more wood, storing more grain, or mending walls with greater care. In this way, Hardship became tutor, and endurance was transformed into practical wisdom for the next year. And so, the cycle wound on, snow into thaw, thaw into planting, planting into harvest, and harvest back toward snow. The peasants lived not against the seasons, but within them, carried along by rhythms older than memory. Endless winters did not crush them, they shaped them, weaving hardship and hope into the same quiet fabric of daily life. Peasant wardrobes were as seasonal as the fields. Winter coats, patched year after year, were carefully hung up in lofts when the weather warmed, yet their smell of smoke, damp wool, and frost lingered as a reminder of hardship. Children would tug on lighter shirts, but mothers often muttered reminders. Don't forget what the coat taught you: always keep an extra layer ready. Spinning wheels turned more quickly in warmer months, producing new thread that would be woven into cloth for winter. Women sang as they worked, their songs mingling gratitude for light with preparation for cold. A shirt woven in June was already destined for January. Every stitch was a bridge between seasons. While heavy winter forced peasants into survival mode, spring and summer reopened space for small crafts that gave dignity to daily life. Men carved wooden spoons or small toys for children, often with patterns echoing frost's shapes. Women embroidered simple designs on shirts or towels, adding bright thread against the dull memory of winter gray. These objects were not luxuries, they carried symbolism, offering continuity through harsh cycles. A spoon carved in summer might be the one used in the lean days of February, bringing with it the comfort of handiwork and memory. With roads clear again, villages reconnected. Weddings, often postponed through the cold months, were held in spring. Neighbors who had not seen each other since the snow began exchanged news and shared bread. These gatherings were more than celebrations, they were renewals of the fragile threads binding community together. In churchyards, people stood longer after services, basking in sunlight, trading stories of how each family had managed through the long winter. The exchange was half practical, sharing tips on storing grain or tending livestock, and half ritual, a communal affirmation that they had all survived. Perhaps nothing marked the end of winter so profoundly as light itself. Days lengthened slowly, then swiftly, and peasants noticed every moment gained. Work could stretch further, but so could leisure. Light was not merely physical illumination, it was reassurance. After enduring months when dawn arrived late and dusk came too soon, the endless glow of summer evenings felt like a gift. Children played in fields until the last streaks of sun vanished. Elders sat on benches, silent, content simply to be warmed. In songs and prayers, light was praised almost as if it were a saint itself. Through all these rhythms, clothing, crafts, gatherings, like the peasants carried a quiet philosophy. Life was not measured by conquest or sudden victories, but by steady endurance. Each year repeated the same challenges, and each year's survival was its own quiet triumph. The winter had been long, and the next would be too. Yet in every spoon carved, every proverb spoken, every field sown, peasants declared a simple truth, that continuity mattered more than change. To live through endless winters was to live with patience, humility, and a kind of wisdom born only of repetition. What seemed endless was not despair, but continuity, a rhythm that bound generations together, linking grandparents to children, and children to those yet unborn. And so, as the seasons turned once more, the Russian peasant stood quietly within the cycle X, accepting the weight of snow, the relief of thaw, and the promise of light with the same steady patience. Winters would always return, as certain as dusk, yet so too would the warmth, the fields, and the laughter of neighbors in the sun. To endure was enough, and in that endurance lay a quiet strength, a wisdom passed from one generation to the next. As you let your own thoughts drift like soft snow across a still meadow, you may find the same calm patience in yourself, carrying you gently into rest.